Okay, so last time, to recap a little bit, I was talking about the family Compositae, which is also called Asteraceae. I still am getting used to using the new names, even though they've been around for many years now. Asteraceae, meaning that it's plants that are like asters, plants that are closely related to the genus Aster, which is a common weed flower type thing that grows in everybody's yard in this climate, in borders of woods and fields and things like that. So daisies, sunflowers, dandelions, chicory, thistles, lettuce are all different parts of this same family, Asteraceae, and they all have flowers, inflorescences, flowering heads that look like a single flower but are made up of lots of tiny flowers, and that's why it was originally called Compositae, because the flowers are like a composite of many smaller flowers. So that's and besides having that feature in common, which is how you can recognize them, they also have in common certain compounds that show up over and over in that family, which would include inulin, which is a polysaccharide, a carbohydrate, lutein, which is a yellow pigment and an antioxidant, latexes of various sorts, which are the milky sap that comes out of dandelions or lettuces or several other. It's not exclusive to this plant family at all, and it's not every plant in the plant family has it, but it is a common thing that shows up in a lot of them. And many of them have a bitter flavor, a bitter and or aromatic flavor to them. They tend to be bitter and cooling. There aren't a lot of spicy Asteraceae. Echinacea is probably the closest thing I can think of to one that would be spicy, and it's more tingly than spicy, which is basically its own whole separate flower that only its own whole separate flavor that only shows up in a few different plants, in a few different herbal medicines or plants that are used in food sometimes, like Szechuan peppercorns, prickly ash, which is a very similar plant to Szechuan peppercorns, and echinacea, and then a few other members of the Compositae family. The prickly ash plant is not in the Compositae family, and there aren't a lot of trees or shrubs in the family. There are a few woody vines and shrubs, but mostly there are tens of thousands of members of the Asteraceae plant family, and most of them are herbaceous plants, annuals or perennials. So besides that plant, so that's kind of just a general recap of that plant family. Apiaceae is another one of the big plant families, one of the biggest families of plants. And by big, I mean that it has a lot of different species in it, not necessarily a comment on how common those species are, just the number of them, although some of them are very common. The old name for this family, Apiaceae means that they're similar to apia, which is celery. So they're, So they're in the celery family. Apium is the genus name. So, and Apiaceae is the family name, which contains many thousands of species and is closely related to another plant family called Aureliaceae, or it's not necessarily, that might not be a strictly accurate statement. It shares a lot of features with a related plant family called Aureliaceae. And Aureliaceae are ivy and ginseng and lots of other related plants. So Apiacea's older name is umbelliferæ because the clusters of flowers, which are just small individual flowers, are arranged in what's called an umbel. An umbel is sort of like an umbrella-shaped cluster of flowers that all radiate out from a common point, or from, there's a common point where it starts and then it can branch, but there are lots of tiny little individual flowers there making up this cluster. Sometimes it's closer to spherical, sometimes it's more like an umbrella shape or a half sphere. But the flowers are discrete. Each flower has its own little stem. It's not like with a daisy where all the flowers are clustered together into one thing and they don't have separate stems. You could pick a single tiny flower from an umbel of Apiaceae, and it would have its own little stem. So a real common member of this family around in this part of the world, and one that probably all of you have seen before, is Queen Anne's lace. If you think of the shape of that flower, that's kind of what most of them look like. Although, like I said, whether that wraps all the way around and becomes a sphere, or whether it's more like an umbrella or a half sphere, varies from one species or one genus to the next. There are many important medicinal plants in this plant family. There are also some important poisonous plants in this plant family, or some well-known poisonous plants in this plant family. So Queen Anne's lace is also in herbal medicine, when people are using it medicinally, they'll often call it wild carrot. It's the same plant as carrot. It's just not a cultivated variety of carrot. In the wild around here, there's a good chance that it's actually descended from tame carrots that were brought over here as crops. And sometimes some of them would go to seed, and those seeds might grow in rougher soil or whatever. So if you dig up the root of it, it has a woody, hard core usually, and it's usually pretty small, and it's very seldom has an orange color to it. It's usually whitish, sometimes slightly yellowish. Sometimes it's a little bit orange at the top near the stem. And the outer part of the root tastes like carrot, but the inner part of the root tastes like wood, and is basically unchewable in most individual plants. Well, that can depend on the soil that it's growing in, and maybe genetics and things too. The seeds are the main part that's used medicinally from this plant. And they have a couple of different uses. One of the uses is that it's a carminative. It helps aid in digestion, and it helps get rid of gas. So if you chew carrot seeds, they have a sort of very slightly bitter aromatic quality that tends to make you produce more saliva. If you cook meat with them, they'll tenderize the meat a bit. So they help break down protein. If they're taken in a strong medicinal decoction, they'll also break up phlegm and help with liver sluggishness of the liver, or if there are stones, sometimes they'll help with that. Help get the liver to flush a bunch of its juices into the digestive system, just like it does with the salivary glands. So it's good for that. Some people also use it for fertility control to try and prevent pregnancy. It's kind of, from what I've heard, it's not necessarily very reliable for that, but some people do use it, apparently successfully. I have not been able to see very good data as to be able to answer the question of how often does this work, and how much better is this than just, not doing anything or whatever. It's so it's, not there's been one small study on it that had positive results, but the methodology of the study wasn't especially rigorous. So there are a lot of other things that could have been going on that might explain the results besides the possibility that it works well. So it's also antiparasitic, very mild antiparasitic, which probably is all part of the same set of properties of it helping promote digestion and movement in the digestive tract of fluids, because parasites are often secondary to constipation. Usually if people get intestinal parasites, it's because their body is not being as hard of a place for parasites to live as it should be. So it's not flushing them out the way that it should, and it's not maybe got enough of the digestive juices that would break them down under other circumstances. So anyway, it does have a history of use as a mild antiparasitic. Another herb that's well known in the herbal world, or another genus of herbs, I should say, is Angelica. Angelica includes multiple species. The two most common ones to see for sale are Angelica archangelica, which is the European Angelica, and Angelica sinensis, also known as Dongguai, which is the Chinese species. And they're very similar. The plants look a little bit different, but the sliced up root is very similar, and the medicinal properties are very similar. It relaxes the heart some, and essentially changes the way that electricity is conducted in the heart by changing the way the body handles calcium. And that has an effect on blood pressure. It's also used often along with other things to help regulate hormones and to sometimes to promote fertility if it's taken at the right times, in the right cycles and things like that. But often in that type of situation, it's sort of a helper herb that's being used along with other herbs. So that's and in Chinese medicine, I think that it is only ever used in formulas. I don't think that it's really pretty much ever used on its own. So that's another member of the family. Some other common ones that you might be familiar with, celery and parsley and cilantro are all part of this family. They're all vegetables. Cilantro and parsley have, and well, celery, the actual juice of the stems, all have stimulating effect on the kidneys. They're diuretic. They tend to have a cooling effect on the body in general. And the seeds of celery are somewhat calming, and that's something that shows up in many plants in this plant family. Caraway is another one. There's a substance called apigenin, and apigenin binds to the same receptor sites in your nervous system that benzodiazepine drugs bind to. So it's actually calming. It doesn't affect that receptor site as strongly. So it's not like, celery seeds aren't going to have the same sort of effect on somebody that the Valium would, but they're doing a very mild version of the same sort of thing in the body. They also promote good digestion, just like what I said about the carrot seeds. And that's also true of many plants in this family. They contain aromatic compounds that help promote good digestion, movement in the digestive tract, and help to expel and relieve gas. So fennel is used for that. Fennel's often used to freshen the breath and help promote digestion after a meal. Indian restaurants often have a dish of it sitting around. The dill seeds do the same kind of thing. There's a remedy called gripe water that's just basically dill tea, and that's used for colic in babies, which is just basically just gas, and maybe sometimes gas along with the liver not being fully functional yet or very strong yet. And so it helps with that, helps relieve, painful intestinal cramping. If somebody's having painful intestinal cramping as a result of a diarrheal illness, it won't really help with the diarrhea, but it will help with that part. It will help with that symptom. And it will just sort of help with help everything to move the direction that it's supposed to be moving, with as little cramping and pain as possible. So I mentioned that these plants have their seeds, their flowers are born in umbels. They're in this particular cluster shape, which is not shaped like a cluster of grapes, but shaped like a cluster of well, it's shaped more like an umbrella type of shape. Sometimes the seeds are fleshy, but most of the time it's like the fruit is a dry seed. Many of them are flattened, have stripes on them. Sometimes the seeds are hairy. Almost all the plants in this family have divided leaves rather than having they sort of have feathery type of leaves, for instance. If you've ever seen the flower, well, if you've ever seen the leaves of Queen Anne's lace, they're sort of divided and then divided again into many little sections. And that's true of poison hemlock as well. A lot of the time people will say poison hemlock looks like wild carrot. And to me, poison hemlock looks like wild carrot in sort of the way that, say, a moose looks like a goat. Once you're used to them, there's really not that much mistaking them for each other. One's much bigger. One is, kind of, they're proportioned differently. The easiest way to tell them apart, or the most easily quantifiable way to tell them apart, is that poison hemlock has a smooth hollow stem with usually purplish splotches on it. It's like green and purple, but it's splotchy. Its Latin name is Conium maculatum, and maculatum means speckled or spotted. So you can actually see poison hemlock greenery right now. It's already up above ground and collecting up sunlight. And, at that stage, I could see someone mistaking it for wild carrot, which is not above ground right now. But as far as looks go, the leaves look kind of similar if you're seeing just the leaves. If you see the plant full grown and in flower, poison hemlock usually is 6 feet tall, sometimes even 8 or 10 feet tall. Wild carrot is very seldom 5 feet tall. It's usually more like 2 to 4 feet tall. And the cluster of flowers on Queen Anne's lace is maybe like this big, and on poison hemlock, it's more like that. It's really, closer to dinner plate size rather than silver dollar size. So there's a big difference in the way the plants are proportioned. But the easiest thing to spot, if you're not familiar with them and you're not doing it from recognition, but you're doing it from looking at specific features, the most easily quantifiable feature is that Queen Anne's lace has a small, solid, hairy stem, and poison hemlock has a large, hollow, smooth stem with splotches on it, and often a powdery, waxy coating on it, kind of like what we've seen on raspberries, black raspberries on our herb walks. So poison hemlock, there's another one called water hemlock that's very similar to poison hemlock, not in the same genus, but contains similar poisons. Both of those will stop your heart. They do the same thing that Angelica does as far as changing how the electrolytes form of calcium is used in your body, and therefore changing how electricity moves in your heart. But in the case of Dong Quai, it does it very mildly, and in the case of poison hemlock, it just, it kills you, stops your heart. So big difference in outcomes as far as those two things go, even though there's a similar mechanism of action at play. Poison hemlock has been used, of course, as a form of execution or suicide historically, because it's one of the easiest plants around to find in a big enough quantity that it would be deadly, and it is deadly. Most poisonous plants around wouldn't kill you if you ate too much of them, or if you ate, a bit of them. They'll make you sick, but poison hemlock will kill you, and does occasionally kill people. It's possible to get poisoned by poison hemlock by having it on your skin. That's a very unusual outcome. If somebody is not, there might be people who are particularly susceptible to it, but I wouldn't really expect somebody to get that level of exposure through their skin unless they were doing something like weed eating and getting it all over them or something like that. So it's a very common plant. It grows in disturbed ground, along roadsides, things like that. So you can see it all around. If you live in a temperate zone in North America, you can start seeing it right now. And it's one of the few green plants that's really growing this time of year in large amounts. Relatively few compared to at other times of year. And it's very common to find it in old fields, roadsides, construction sites, anywhere that the ground's been turned up. Water hemlock mostly grows along streams and edges of ponds, things like that. One really interesting feature of these plants is that some birds, like quail, can eat the seeds, which then makes their body poisonous. And if someone or something tries to eat the quail, then they'll get very sick or die. So birds are actually able to make themselves poisonous by consuming these plants, which don't seem to affect them to the same degree as they do humans and other mammals. So let's see. Yeah, so there are quite a few poisonous plants in this family, and so it's really important that you be very sure what you're getting if you're gathering them for yourselves. You have to make sure that you know how to recognize the poisonous ones that grow in your area, and know how to recognize the medicinal ones too, so that when you're gathering something, there's no question in your mind as to what it is that you're gathering. And if you're going to someplace else, you need to either learn how to use a dichotomous key, where it helps you look up various different features, and the key is like a list of steps, and each step will say something is the stem hairy, yes or no? And then if it's yes, then you turn to a different page, and it takes you to the next question to narrow it down further from all the hairy ones. So if you know how to use that kind of a key, you can identify plants with a pretty high degree of confidence. Apart from that, it's good to have someone show you who you're sure knows what they're talking about. So yeah, this is one of the few plant families where there are very deadly plants and very medicinal plants and food plants all in the same family together, and they're all very common. You know, in nightshade, for instance, you do have some deadly plants in the nightshade family and some medicinal plants as well, and some food plants like tomatoes and potatoes, but usually it's not the same parts. You know, if you ate tomato leaves, you'd get sick, you know. If you eat with poison hemlock, there's no part of the plant that is not poisonous. And with wild carrot, there's no part of the plant that is poisonous. So, you know, it's kind of different in a way. And they're very common, you know, they're all very common things to encounter in the wild. Whereas most of the food members of the nightshade you wouldn't encounter in the wild. Most of the deadly ones you might, but very seldom. So it's well, some of the poisonous ones are pretty common, but anyway, very important to know what you're getting when it comes to this plant family. There are also some ecologically sensitive members of the plant family that are aromatic plants that grow in the Rocky Mountains and in the West. Osha is one of them. Osha is probably the main one or best known one. Osha is used apparently in some Native American medicine lodges and other situations for purifying the body and for breaking up stuff from the lungs. And it's good for that, but it's very over harvested, often by people who are just, you know, burning it for a smudge or something like that and not even necessarily using it for a very serious medicinal purpose, or a very specific medicinal purpose. So it's been very over harvested, and the tribes that live where it lives, some of them have, you know, asked people not to harvest it because it's you know, only grows in very select places and is easily disturbed, and it's a root, so once you dig up the root, you know, the plant's gone. That individual plant is gone. So
Andrew, how do you spell that? Sorry,
Osha,
how do you? Mm-hmm.
it's spelled Osha. There's another plant called Lomatium, which is very similar. And contains, you know, really good medicine for breaking up phlegm and congestion, helping to keep respiratory infections from turning into pneumonia, things like that. It's pretty good medicine. But there are some other more common things or more easily cultivated things, because these plants are not easily cultivated. And I think really that nobody has successfully cultivated them at any kind of useful scale. So, you know, maybe some people have grown a little bit here and there, but not like farming this stuff actually. So it's the supply in the herb industry is basically all wild plants harvested from selective and sensitive habitats. And so, you know, it's for me, this is a plant that I'm really not gathering right now. Or, you know, not having gathered for me either. There are some other plants that I feel have similar properties. Lovage is one of them. That's a European plant that is closely related, but is very easily cultivated. Celeriac is a milder version of the same thing. Celeriac is a variety of celery that's grown for its roots, and the root is a big ball-like root, sort of like a beet or a turnip, but much larger. And it can be sliced up and dried and then made into medicine. And when you dry it, most of it dries away. But it has some resins in it that are aromatic, that are very well, they're a different type of decongestant than what you would get from mint or from composite type plants or whatever. It's got its own this particular plant family has its own flavor to it, even the poisonous ones. There are certain substances in them. Some of them have that sort of tingly mouthfeel, but much milder compared to what I was saying about Echinacea. Some of them just have a sort of an aromatic flavor that if you've ever eaten a carrot and you eat the very end of the carrot and it tastes bitter and has a sort of a weird aromatic taste to it, that flavor sort of permeates this whole plant family, or very small variations on that flavor sort of permeate this entire family of plants. And there's a substance called umbelliferone that is kind of a major component of that flavor, and that is a very frequent substance to be found in all these different plants. So that's something that is in many of these plants, and is partly responsible for the antiparasitic properties, partly responsible for the decongestant properties, and so on. So those plants, the Osha and Lomatium, are pretty environmentally sensitive, but there are some similar plants that can be grown in a garden pretty easily, including lovage and celeriac. Right now, or not quite right now, but very soon, there is a plant in this family that will be blooming out in the woods called sweet cicely. And sweet cicely has a sort of licoricey flavor. It's a little bit different than licorice or fennel, but it's kind of, I guess it's closer to fennel. It's not as earthy as licorice, but it is extremely sweet. And there's some individual variation from plant to plant in how sweet they are, but I don't know how to explain it, except that like some things are too spicy to eat, and sometimes sweet cicely root is like too sweet to eat. Like it's so sweet that it's hard to tolerate because of how intense the sweet flavor is. I've used a very small slice of the root to flavor a big pot of tea before, to sweeten, I should say, a big pot of herbal tea before. So it's an interesting plant, and it is member of this family. Looks very similar to fairly similar to Queen Anne's lace, but the leaves and the stems are smooth, and it's very small. It's maybe 6 inches high or something like that, and it grows on the forest floor before the leaves come out on the trees. So that sweet flavor is something that comes up in a few different plants in this family, like fennel, and glycerin. No, it's not glycerin. I can't remember what the substance responsible for it is, but it's in several of them. And a lot of those plants that have that licoricey taste that are in this family have the reputation of being something that enhances mental clarity. So I use some of them, including fennel, for that. Fennel also promotes digestion, and it promotes lactation. So it's having interesting effects on the nervous system, the endocrine system, the digestive system, some pretty big important systems in the body and in the metabolism, the human metabolism, but it's doing it in a very mild and very well tolerated way. You don't have people going on fennel-induced rampages or anything like that. It's a very, very well tolerated herb, even though it is having an effect on some very major systems of the body. And that's one of the things I love about herbal medicine, is that you can often get the good side of things without the bad side of things, or you can get intense medicinal effects without intense side effects pretty often, because people's bodies are made to handle the things in plants. We've been eating plants since the beginning of the world or whatever for a long time, and our bodies and our genetics and everything are designed to be able to, they're adapted to be able to handle those things. And so a lot of the time we don't get side effects even when we're getting big effects, because our body knows how to cancel them out, because we're designed to be able to metabolize substances from plants. Just a moment, I'll be right back. Okay. So with this plant family also, most of them are herbaceous plants. A lot of them are perennials or biennials. So for instance, with some of them, they're annuals or biennials, like carrots, Queen Anne's lace. It will usually have 1 year, and this is poison hemlock does this too. It'll usually have 1 year where it's just foliage, where an individual plant is just foliage. And then in the second year, it will send up a flowering stem. And what's happening there is that when the foliage comes out, it's collecting sunlight and turning it into energy, turning it into food, starches that are being stored up in the roots, also making the secondary metabolites, the medicines and the poisons and things, storing those up in the leaves, and then when the leaves die down, storing them in the root. And then in the second year, once it's stored enough energy to do so, it sends up a flowering stem and makes seeds and reproduces. So that's its kind of life cycle, and its strategy is that it spends 1 whole year just storing up energy, and then the second year turning that energy into reproduction. An interesting thing about how they store medicines and other substances is that can actually move around in the plant during the course of a day. So poison hemlock is actually more poisonous. The root is more poisonous at night because some of the substances get stored in the root overnight and then released in the day. They're sort of evaporating out of the plant in the heat of the day and attracting insects to the plant to pollinate it. But then they're being stored away at night. Sometimes poison hemlock is more poisonous at certain times of day than at others. And other plants do this to some extent too. They move the substances in them around because they might be trying to attract, a particular insect most plants that are pollinated by insects aren't just pollinated by whatever insect. They're pollinated by certain insects. And for some plants like orchids, that's highly specialized. For some plants like dandelions, it's just kind of, it's pretty wide open. But you know, there will be, for example, bees will visit a wide variety of flowers, including a lot of the compositae flowers. But then there are certain, you know, plants that are, or certain insects that only work with each other. And so various different plants will do things to attract those insects, which can be color, can also be scent, which is usually plant chemicals, and maybe some other things like pheromones as well that are, you know, substance based, and those are usually somehow conserved by the plants during times when that pollinator wouldn't be available. So if it's a nocturnal moth, the orchid wouldn't be putting off the smell to attract it during the day when the moth isn't out and about anyway. Because anytime substances from a plant are out in the air where they can be smelled, they're being lost by the plant, even though it's in, you know, relatively small quantities. But you know, if you can smell the substances in a plant, that means that they've left the plant. At least that bit of them has. So, you know, keep that in mind whenever you know, smelling herbs or things like that, that some of the medicine is escaping as you smell it, which is why we usually keep things in jars, even though it makes the room nice if they're in open containers or baskets or something like that. It makes it smell nicer, but it also makes them lose their potency faster, since it is disappearing into the air around them. The Apiaceae, the umbelliferate, tend to be mostly non-tropical. So they tend to mostly grow in the temperate zones, like where I am. And then sometimes in tropical areas, the Aurelia family plants tend to kind of take their ecological role more, or be more in the ecological role that the Apiaceae would have been in temperate zones. Well, that's not strictly true, because there are certain members of that family that do grow in colder places. Ivy being a good example. Ivy is, you know, known to grow in colder, not Arctic type places, but, you know, England's covered with this stuff, for instance, and it's a fairly cold sort of place. You know, it's a more or less weedy plant there that grows of its own accord. I mean, it's a woody vine, but it you know, doesn't need anyone to plant it necessarily. It just kind of shows up. So one of the plants that I wanted to talk about today is spruce. Spruce is a very common plant worldwide. It doesn't really grow where I live of its own accord. It grows further north in the circumboreal forest, which is a belt of forest that stretches around the northern part of the world. So, and it's one of the largest ecosystems on land on Earth. So, you know, you have a lot of this type of forest in the northern United States and Canada, Alaska, Russia, northern Europe, all the way around, you know, south of the Arctic and subarctic areas, but still far enough north that it's pretty cold a lot of the time. Spruces are adapted to ice and snow. They're adapted also to fairly dry summers, not super dry, but not like desert or anything, but they can live, you know, in an area that isn't real wet all the time. And here in Lexington, they were a popular landscaping tree in the 50s and 60s. There aren't nearly as many of them still standing as there were 20 years ago, but a lot of them still are because they're fairly long-lived. But they're also pretty susceptible to damage by wind and some diseases as well. But they're fairly tolerant of snow. If snow falls on them, the branches are designed to the branches normally come out of the tree almost not quite horizontally, but slightly angled down from horizontal. And when weight gets on them, they just sort of bend till they're almost flat against the trunk. The needles are designed to collect water from fog. So during foggy mornings, dew will collect on the needles, and the needles will sort of funnel the dew or channel the dew down onto the branches and down toward the roots. So spruces have this very, Christmas tree type shape to them. They're kind of triangular if you see a spruce standing alone from the distance. When you go up to them and look at them, the clusters, the needles are not, so in pine trees, the needles are born in little bundles where there will be a bunch of pine needles that are all real close to each other, joining the leaf stem at the same place. And in spruce, it doesn't have that. It has single sort of roundish or squarish needles that are very prickly. They're stiff and prickly. So it's different than hemlock, which has flat needles, but a similar overall shape. The hemlock that lives around here has flat needles that are more whitish on the underside and more of a shiny green on the top side. And it can further be distinguished if you look at the cones, because the cones on a hemlock are very small. They're maybe the size of a fingertip, whereas the cones on a spruce are quite a bit bigger. So yeah, spruces are prickly. They have squarish or sometimes rounded individual needles, and the needles are short and born in sort of a group that looks a little bit like a bottle brush or something like that. The tips of spruce are edible, and the early cones are as well, and they're pretty good to eat. They're not super piney tasting, not super resiny tasting. They're slightly sour, have a tender, almost fruit-like flavor to them, even though they're actually, not fruit. And they're pretty rich in carbohydrates. So yeah, including some simple sugars. And they can be fermented. You can take the little soft tips from spruce. You can pick a whole bunch of them. They're bright green. You can see when the spruce is in tips, has tips on it, because they're the soft tips are bright green. So you can cook a bunch of those in water, and then you can ferment that water and make a spruce beer out of it. And the first time I made this, I was pretty surprised that it didn't taste like pine needles or like an evergreen tree. It just basically tasted like regular beer, which I was kind of surprised by, because when you do eat them, they do have a pretty distinctive flavor. But when they're made into the beverage, the fermentation process, that those terpenoids, the substances that make it taste kind of piney, those go away, and you're just left with a pretty normal fermented, fizzy, sour, slightly boozy type of flavor. So that's something that I've made before. That's, you know, a popular drink in some places and a biologically acceptable sort of probiotic. It does contain a little bit of alcohol, probably like 2% or so, which is not appropriate for everybody, but for a lot of people, it doesn't really feel like much. The harder, stiffer parts of the plant, if you try and make the same thing from them, it does taste more piney, or it tastes different. But the soft tender tips are really good for that. The sap of the plant is also medicinal, although it's hard to gather enough of it for it to be very meaningful. Sometimes when the plants are burnt, or when the logs or sticks are burned, tar will ooze out the end of them, and that's also has been used medicinally. Particularly, it's been added to soaps to help with skin conditions like eczema and maybe some other itchy, irritated type skin conditions. It's just sort of soothing and cooling. If you make a tea out of either the inner bark or the mature dark green needles of spruce, it's very decongestant. It's very resiny. It does make your teeth kind of sticky, which I find pretty unpleasant, but it will break up congestion. And so that's, you know, is something important to know about that plant. It's not a plant that I use medicinally a whole lot, partly because it's not a plant that grows here very much, and partly because a lot of other plants do grow here. But if you lived in the boreal forests where there's less biodiversity and lots of conifers, then it would be good to know about and be able to use it for its medicinal properties. I'll be right back. All right. So another herb that I wanted to talk about today, the other herb I want to talk about today is poke, pokeweed, or poke root especially, although there are medicinal compounds in and medicinal uses for the whole plant. So now the thing about poke is it is poisonous. It's actually quite poisonous. And if you're going to use it medicinally, you have to do so carefully. But it's not something that you need to completely avoid. Everything that I just said about being poisonous and needing to be used carefully also applies to, say, something like ibuprofen, which a lot of people are really comfortable with and use all the time. I'm not saying that they have similar medicinal properties, but I will say that a lot more people die from ibuprofen than die from poke. Probably even proportional to how many people use them. Although I don't necessarily have that data for sure. But so it is poisonous, but poisonous in a medicine kind of way. When somebody gets too much poke, it can make them feel sort of delirious, sort of like a drunken type of state. And it usually makes their bowels move very fast, causes people to have watery diarrhea. And it can upset people's electrolytes and make them lose consciousness. I have looked for cases of people dying from pokeweed, and this has been several years ago that I did this search, but I was not able to find any confirmed cases from modern times of anyone actually dying from accidentally consuming it. And here in Kentucky, it's also a cultural food. People gather the young leaves from the plant when a new plant starts growing and cook them, and then pour off the water, and then cook them in water again and pour that off, and then cook it in a third change of water, and then strain it and usually add some oil and basically just serve it the way they would greens, so with some oils and some spices and things. So that's called, people call that poke salad. And it's a fairly common wild food that people in this area still eat. So, it is a poisonous plant, but in addition to the poison, there are a lot of nutrients in it. And the poison is actually there, to protect the nutrients from animals feeding on it. So humans have figured out a way to get rid of that by repeatedly changing the water while cooking it. The poisons that are in poke are sort of soapy in nature. They will suds when they're shaken if you get them out into liquid. It's a very drying remedy. It makes a lot of fluid leave your system, so it can be very drying. I mostly use poke topically. So if somebody has sort of like a benign growth or some kind of bump on their skin or under their skin, and you take a thin slice of poke and tape it over that with a bandage, it will usually cause it to shrink. It won't necessarily cause it to go away, but it will make it smaller. Sometimes it will make it go away completely and sometimes not. But that's something that it's traditionally used for, either as a poultice of a thin slice of the root or a salve made by slicing the root up, letting the slices dry, and then cooking them in oil and using that to make a salve by hardening it with beeswax. And it seems to work pretty well for growths and things like that. I have used it. I had one interesting case where I used this with someone who had some lymphatic tumors, and it made them go away. And the person had been diagnosed as having stage 4 cancer. They had some tumors in their neck and in the lymph glands of their neck, and using poke internally in small amounts and then topically as well made them go away, and they stayed gone. And it was not necessarily something that works every time, but in that particular person's case, it appeared to save their life, appeared to get them out of a very bad disease state. So it moves the fluid in the lymph system very, very strongly. And that has immune implications and also implications for the digestive system. Usually, a poke salve is a good way to keep it around and keep it handy for use. Although if you want to use fresh poke, you can almost always find poke because it grows year after year in the same place. And even though the above ground part dies in the winter, it's usually still standing there come spring. It's just standing there dead. So if you know what that looks like, you can often find the root. And if you dig up a poke root is often like 5 pounds or something. They're really large. They're not wooden, but they look like logs. They have a hard, crackly surface that's kind of reminiscent of the bark of logs, but they're soft-ish, like a root vegetable, and they can be sliced up and dried. And it's very easy to dig. A lot of it, you only ever need a little tiny bit of it at a time. Usually if I'm giving someone poke to take internally, I'm not giving it to them straight. I'm giving it to them as part of a formula, and in the formula in such a way that the amount that they're taking is maybe 20 drops or so at a dose, maybe fewer than that. So it's usually a very small part of a formula that would include various other things for what they are, whatever they're dealing with. In Appalachian traditional medicine, we would call it a tonic, just basically meaning that it changes the tone and character of the tissue in the body, but especially with a view towards the fact that it changes how the body's eliminative processes are functioning, so that it's kind of having a cleansing effect on the body by strongly affecting the spleen and the lymph system, and getting waste products out of the body that way. Poke is a fairly large herbaceous plant, one of the bigger herbaceous plants around, along with poison hemlock, which is also poisonous. But poke has purple berries, which birds eat and distribute the seeds of. And when you crush up the berries, the juice is this very intense magenta color. And so, sometimes people use that for ink or dye sort of application. It doesn't necessarily last real well for real long, though. It tends to fade to a more brownish color, but when it goes on, it's like this bright, vibrant magenta. That's not a color you would encounter a lot in nature. But the stems of the plant are that color as well. It has bright, neon pink stems in the summertime. When they first start out, they're greenish, and then they get a little bit red, and then they just kind of get less green and more magenta as time goes on. But then the plant produces berries, and when the berries ripen, the leaves start to die. So the leaves have sometimes been used medicinally in a similar way to what I described with the root as being like a poultice. I don't really use the leaves that way. I use the root that way, and I sometimes cook with the leaves. But it contains a lot of the same substances. And so that's, a poisonous plant that if you're careful with it, is not inappropriate to use for someone with, the level of experience that you probably have of having, at least at this point, hopefully, a fairly solid background in understanding some things about how herbal medicine works, but without necessarily having a lot of clinical experience using it for people yet. So anyway, it's a good one to know about, and a good one to not use very often, but kind of keep in your back pocket in case you need it. Not literally in your back pocket, but maybe in your backyard. Keep in reserve in case you need it. It's like I've mentioned this before, but the traditional medicine where I'm from in Eastern Kentucky has a tendency to be heroic and dramatic, and the most favorite remedies are the ones that produce a really intense physiological response that's very visible from the outside and so forth. And so poke is definitely in that category, along with tobacco and cayenne and marijuana and various other intense herbs. It produces a big dramatic effect. But it is affecting the nervous system, and it's affecting the lymphatic system. And it can affect both of them pretty strongly. I've had the experience of feeling weird from handling it, particularly from straining the tincture. And I was straining the tincture through a cloth and kind of squeezing it out with my hands. And I was getting it on my hands. And after a while, it kind of made me feel a little bit weird. Definitely made everything feel just kind of a little bit funny. So it is something that you could transdermally get enough of it to make you feel off, and probably upset your digestion and move your lymph strongly and dehydrate you and all that sort of thing. But like I said, it tends to be fairly self-limiting in terms of its poisonous powers. It doesn't tend to kill people, tends to give people really bad diarrhea, sometimes some delirium or something like that, which is bad enough. And if somebody's not expecting it, it's definitely would be a reason why they would never take medicine from you again. If you explain to them that it might happen, then maybe they'd be willing to, depending on what the benefits were compared to that outcome. So yeah, it's definitely an herb that needs to be treated with a lot of respect and not played with, but not necessarily one that you need to be afraid of, or it's not like trying to use foxglove or hemlock medicinally. It's a good level below that, in terms of how intense its effects are compared to what sort of benefits you might see from it. And like I said, in my practice, when I use this plant, I would say 19 times out of 20, I'm using it topically, and I'm using it for something that is clearly a benign growth on the skin or a lump on a tendon or something like that, where it's going to decrease the size of it, maybe decrease how much it's interfering with the tissues around it, but not necessarily, anything more than that. And it's pretty serviceable in that capacity. All right. Any questions about poison, about pokeweed or spruce? So there's a question, if you wanted to give a small amount of Apiaceae seeds for post-digestion gas and discomfort, which one or two would you try first? I would try fennel first and maybe dill seed second. Fennel is really good for it. It's really sweet. If my experience is basically that fennel works on digestive stuff that is above the belly button, and dill works on the digestive stuff that is below the belly button as far as where you're feeling the discomfort. Either one works some on both because it's all connected, and it's all the same tube full of gas and liquids and solids, but it's, they seem to work on different sections of it a little bit differently. But they're both, either of those two, dill and fennel would be the first ones that I would work with. Caraway works well for that as also, but I don't use it for that as much. I feel like it's not quite as good as the other two for that. What I do love caraway for, though, is for anxiety, like as an as needed remedy for anxiety that doesn't cause sleepiness, because just about everything for anxiety makes people feel a little bit drowsy, except cigarettes, and those are terrible for you. But caraway is really mild. It doesn't upset your stomach the way that lobelia might, or that nicotine definitely would, but it makes people feel less anxious. And it doesn't make them feel stimulated either. It just makes them feel less anxious without affecting, stimulation or sedation in any meaningful degree. And so that's a really useful tool to have in your toolkit. And it's not one that many herbalists are using. Like, I don't think that I've ever gone into an herb shop or a place that sells supplements or something like that and seen a caraway based formula for anxiety or stress or something like that. It's in a lot of old books, but it's not something that is really, maybe it just wasn't exotic enough or something like that for the modern herb market, but it's not something that you see very much. And it's a common, readily available culinary herb, and it's good medicine. I make a very strong decoction of it that I turn into a syrup. So it's actually got sugar and water and caraway in it as the three ingredients. And that's a really nice anxiety remedy for children that they can take like as needed. It doesn't really have much of a downside to it, and sometimes it's really helpful with the anxiety. So that's an interesting and useful use of that particular herb. And like I said, one of the main common substances in the umbelliferae family is this apigenin, which is probably partly responsible for the digestive cramping effects of the carminative herbs, but it's also seemingly, I believe, is also what is responsible for the calming effects that some of them have, including caraway. Yeah, so yeah, fennel would be my first one for the indigestion piece. Hang on just a second here. So, okay, there you go. So we have one more herb walk to do, and then we have the weekend intensive as well before this course is over. And so I am not absolutely set in stone in this, but what I'm looking at right now is the weekend of March 11th being the date for the early spring herb walk. And if we make it out into the woods at that particular time, there should be some interesting stuff for us to see going on, and get to see some of the late winter, early spring, or the transitional period between winter and spring that's going on in the natural world at that time, where a lot of these winter annuals are starting to bloom, the things that have been collecting sunlight all winter long, and also some things that stored up their energy from last year and are ready to bloom early in the year, like trout lilies and bloodroot. So if we go back to the Palisades Nature Sanctuary, there should be some good things to see there at that particular time. So that is what I'm leaning towards as far as our early spring herb walk. And the intensive is going to be in February, and I'm going to have it here. I'll have a classroom, so a dedicated classroom, which I did not have at the old place. So I'm excited about using it for that, among other things. And at some point in the next couple of weeks, possibly sometime next week, I'm going to announce a series of classes that are sort of free and open to the public that are going to be here, just to kind of get people acquainted with and familiar with my practice in the new space and things like that. But if any of you wanted to attend those, I think that would be, some good, interesting topics as well. It'll be more focused on some basic stuff like using herbs with children, things like that. So anyway, those will be some classes that I'm going to be offering in the pretty near future as well. And I hope, and also in somewhere in March, I'm going to have an open house here, which will just be kind of event to bring people in and show them the space primarily, but also to talk about my practice. And if anybody wanted to come and visit the space at that time, that would be a good chance to. And I'd love to have you here and show you around and talk about the kind of ins and outs of what I do and how I bring herbal medicine to the community through the space. So anyway, I'll be announcing those events when I have specific dates for them. Right now, I'm just kind of have general ideas rather than specific dates, because this is frankly been one of the most hectic few weeks periods of my life. I didn't know until New Year's Eve that I needed to find a place, and so I only had till the 31st of January to find it, and not only to find it, but to get moved into it. So it was all very short notice, and I still have to go over, when I finish this class, I have to go over and finish packing at the old space and bringing stuff over here. So it's quite a process, quite a hectic process. And next week things will be a lot calmer, and I will probably be in better form and everything like that than I am this week. So next time we're going to be talking about Fabaceae, which is also called Leguminosae, which is another one of the big plant families that produces a lot of food, medicine, some poison, and things like that. So that's another one of the sort of royal families of the plant kingdom, if you would. One of the families that has a lot of members with a lot of some common patterns among them, but also some very distinctive or a wide variety of different types of plants within that group. Yeah, the free classes will definitely be recorded and probably posted not to the YouTube that I post these to, but to my other channel, youtube.com/clinicalherbalist, where I post where I was posting my medicine show videos before the pandemic. I haven't done as much of them since then, but yeah, all the classes will be on there, will be recorded and will be posted on there. So, for those of you who will not be able to attend them, there will be you'll be able to at least see or hear about what I ended up talking about and what went on at them. All right, any questions about any of that for today? All right, so as of tomorrow, it's February, so I will be sending out a new round of Square invoices to the people who do those, and to those of you who send something to me by Venmo, feel free to do that. Yeah, all right, well, thank you all for coming, and I will talk to you again soon.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too, thanks.